A brief history of left behind places, and then I'll tell you at the bottom of this slide what I plan to do in the next 20 minutes or so. They haven't always been called left behind places. That's the last couple of years, I think, but government concern about these types of places dates at least as far back as the aftermath of the Great Depression, notably the Special Areas Act of 1934. Interventions continue through the post-war period, like the development areas, urban regeneration initiatives from the 70s onwards, support for coastal communities and former mining towns through the late 80s and 90s, and now, even now. These initiatives from the government were paralleled by a great amount of academic and media interest, with the latest concerns neatly summarized by Andreas Rodriguez-Pose's paper in 2018, putting forward the view that the whole Brexit vote and the rise of popularism constitute the revenge of the left behind places. So, as Fran mentioned, 4th of March was the announcement of the Stronger Towns Fund, and I don't think I've seen much more about it in the media, so I'm not sure we really do know much more than was announced on March the 4th about the idea of £1.6 billion spread over 7-year financial years, which £1 billion was to be allocated on a formula that would target places with weaker economies, lower incomes, and fewer skills. So I suppose it really should be called Making Towns Stronger Again Fund, a bit like Making America Great Again Fund. So anyway, the aims today, 2 aims basically, and 2 parts to the talk. First of all, to identify specific places which the fund is likely to be targeting, and to show how, secondly, to show how the ONS Longitudinal study can help to study their migration patterns. Now, in the original announcement, there was a breakdown of the 1.6, or the £1 billion that was to be allocated by formula, which was a notional breakdown. It said like £281 million for the Northwest region, £103 million for the Northeast region. I'm not quite sure how notional these figures were, but they are actually in print, and presumably they're based on some formula that was already in place at that stage. Anyway, we're going to take our own approach to this and try to identify the places that would most justify support under the fund. We had that one. So, what are our expectations? I don't need to spend too much time on this slide, I suppose, but I thought it would be interesting to remind myself that it's about a third of a century ago since I started getting interested in this, with the first ranking of towns that Anne Green and I did for the Great Britain, which adopted the Places Rated Almanac approach that was very popular in the early 80s, and it's still continuing in the US. And we ranked the Kurds, the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies, Newcastle University, local labour markets using an index based on a combination of indicators that ranked these 280 labour market areas from top Winchester, Hampshire, through to Consett County, Durham at the bottom. The most recent Kurd study of this was done for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a report on unequal growth that was published 2 years ago, and that was focusing on the UK's largest 74 cities, and we developed an index of relative decline, and the highest on that index of relative decline was Rochdale, and then you can see more familiar names going through. Can everyone see the screen? Okay, I don't need to read them out. And then ONS has also been active, and Richard Prothero is here, who did the Understanding Towns, the one at the bottom. Did you do you did the major towns as well, did you? Yeah. I don't think there was an index there, but there was some very interesting information on showing weakness in economic terms, those places with lowest median house prices like Burnley, Oldham, most deprived IND, and Oldham, West Bromwich. Net out commuting was an interesting one. The highest levels of net out commuting included one case from the southeast, Chatham, as a sign of weakness in terms of local labour job supply or labour demand, Sutton Coldfield, South Shields. And then the most recent report, which have got lots and lots of data for over 1,000 urban areas in England and 100 and something in Wales as well. So those are sorts of places that we would expect to come out and score high in any ranking. This is our approach. Ollie created a ranking of places via a composite index based on the criteria that were set out on the 4th of March announcement of the fund. The places are grouped into deciles, 10 groups, and we examined their aggregate characteristics with a particular focus on the lowest ranking of the 10 categories, the places most likely to qualify for the pot. In terms of migration behaviour, we're focusing on address changes between these 10 categories over the intercensal decade, 2001 to 2011. 10-year migration, you might call it. See how many people who started off in a particular decile of these on this tenfold ranking remained in the same decile at the 2011 census, and if they had changed decile by then, where they'd moved to. And so far, we've extracted data, Ollie's extracted data for 4 variables: gender, age group, ethnicity, as reported in 2011, and housing tenure, which obviously can change over time in unpredictable ways, unlike age, as reported both in both censuses to detect tenure change. So, first of all, 3 slides on creating the STF index. Now, the 5 criteria that MHCLG put out in their announcement, their formula was to be based on a combination of productivity, income, skills, deprivation measures, and the proportion of people living in towns. So from that information, that's the last piece, we presume they're using data mainly for individual local authorities for these 5 dimensions. And so that's what Ollie has done, and extracted data and put it on a local authority, unitary authority basis for each of those 5 characteristics. So criteria. So I won't go into detail except to tell you how they're ranked. So fairly obviously, lower rank, lower productivity. Income is based on lower rank, lower household income. Skills, higher proportion of people with no qualifications or level 1 qualifications. Deprivation, higher proportion of lower level, what are called super upward areas in the lowest decile, and the proportion living in towns at basically the local authority scale. Right, so each of those scores, so each of those 5 were basically ranked, and then summed to give an overall score, and then the overall score itself was ranked, so you could divide the 326 local authorities in England, or whatever there are, into 10 groups. And then the codes for these decile scores were then attached to the data in the ONS, so you could extract information for each of the deciles, and in particular in terms of my interest in migration, see which decile people were living in 2001 and where in 2011. Anyway, in terms of the results of that ranking exercise, this is the 32 local authorities that are in the weakest decile. And you'll see a lot of familiar names there, and you can see it's dominated by northern candidates. northeast, northwest, Yorkshire and Humber. But there are also some representatives from the West Midlands, the East Midlands, the East of England region, and there's just one candidate in this group from the southeast, Swale, down in Kent, which is my homeland. As you'll see, some are coastal, some are remote or rural, some are old industrial and mining. Some of these places are all three, in fact, all three of those characteristics. So anyway, that is the decile 1, we call it, the decile that most merits, or needs, shall we say, support under the Stronger Towns Fund. This is the migration data now, and it's in this form that Ollie has produced the migration data from me. It's what we call an origin and destination matrix. So down the left-hand side are the origin deciles. In the top one, the 1 is the weakest decile. So the 41,882 longest LS members in that category are people who were living in that decile, the worst decile, both in 2001 and in 2011. They may not have moved house at all. They may have moved house within the same local authority, or they have moved to another local authority in the same decile. So it includes all those people. If you go along the row, that shows the people who started in the worst decile, where they were in 2011 through the other 9 deciles. So we'll analyze that data in a minute. And if you go down the column, it shows how many people at the bottom were living in that decile in 2011 and where they came from in terms of where they were living in 2001. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see we've got 397,000 LS members in this total matrix, with 1.1% sample representing a bit over 40 million people who were identified in the census in England in 2001 and in 2011. So they, by 2011, they have to be 10 years old, as we look at when we look at the age groups. So, similar tables to this, another 11 tables basically, have been developed for males, females, 4 age groups, 2 ethnicities, white and other ethnicity. We couldn't divide down the other ethnicity into more specific ethnicities because we ran into a small numbers problem, which is something that's quite familiar with LS users, that a number less than 10, a count of less than 10, is treated as disclosive and can't be released for publicly. So, first question. What percentage of a decile's 2011 residents had been living in a different decile in 2001? So this is newcomers. What proportion of the 2011 decile population are new to that decile compared with 2001? And you can see that the weakest decile, number 1, has the fewest newcomers in it from over the decade. It rises a bit through deciles 2 and 3, and then is an increasing proportion, about a fifth of the population of the other deciles were new to that decile compared to 2001, dropping off a bit towards the top, which there's a lot of speculation as to why this would be the case, but I suggest that the top deciles, 9 and 10, are harder for people to move into because of their higher cost. For instance, 10, half of the local authorities in decile 10 are London boroughs, so it gives you an impression of how difficult it is to move in. Now, the opposite way around, looking at what proportion of the deciles 2001 residents had moved out to a different decile by 2011, and you can see it's a a much more regular pecking order in a sense, and it may be a surprise to some of you if you're not familiar with migration behavior and the literature on migration behavior, but the decile with the fewest people leaving it is the worst decile of local authorities on basis of our score, at about 11-12%, and then it gradually rises through as you get to the stronger and stronger towns or local authorities. And the key reason for this is that the more dynamic local authorities and places do tend to have the more mobile populations in terms of people moving in and out of them. London is obviously a particularly dynamic area in terms of inflows and outflows, as you read all the time. So that's not surprising. At 9, which contains most of the other London boroughs, as well as 10, this is why they score so highly on this particular variable. If we put these two together, you can get some idea of the net change of population as a result of these the 10-year changes of address of this sample. Virtually no change in the population of the weakest decile as a result of all this moving around, and basically all 3 of the weakest ones have the lowest 10-year turnover. 4 to 7, the middle ones, grow the fastest, and then the strongest ones actually are the ones that, in net terms, lose the most of this particular cohort of people who were 0 years old in 2001, plus became 10 years old in 2011. Now, how do the age groups contribute to this net migration? So the age groups are in 4 panels across the screen here, and decile 1 is in red, and you can see a significant net loss of 16 to 25s. They were the ones that were 6 to 15 in 2001 became 16 to 25 in 2011. You can see the net loss from decile 1 and also the next weakest decile as well. The strongest deciles in the sort of shocking pink and dark blue are the ones that in net terms over that decade lost most older people, and that's perhaps no surprise again when you think of London and other pressurized places in the southeast, people moving out either at family age, because the third age group would be age 36 to 54 in 2001, moving out either for family reasons or for retirement, getting near to retirement, moving out of these more successful, pressurized, stronger towns. Now, focusing just in on those who left the worst decile after 2001, where did they go by 2011? And you can see that the majority went to the next 3 weakest deciles, 2, 3, and 4. And then there's a group 5, 6, and 7 with a bit under 10% of the total numbers leaving the weakest decile. And then 8, 9, and 10, the strongest of the local authorities. Between them, they only accounted for about 13, 14% of all those who left the first decile over that decade. Now, I can assume that's partly due to housing cost, but there's also a geographical factor. Most migration tends to be short distance to surrounding places, and surrounding places are often quite similar to the places in the middle. So there is a geographical as well as a cost element likely to be working here. Now, where were those leaving decile 1 living in 2011 by characteristics? So the top row here is a compound bar graph of the information that was on the previous slide. That's why the first 2, 3, and 4 are so dominant, taking up over 60% of the people that left that decile. How much variation is there across the variables that we have extracted data for so far? We can see in the notes at the bottom, those aged 65 and over in 2011 and social renters are more likely to move to decile 2, the next weakest, than the average for all people at the top. The 16 to 25, the youngest age group we've got here, and private renters, as of 2011, are less likely to move to decile 2, but more so to decile 3. And that can be partly explained by decile 3 containing many of the local authorities with civic universities around the north of England and West Midlands. So that includes Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool, Birmingham, they're in decile 3. Manchester and Newcastle make it into decile 4, so they're the others major drawing points for student migration for those coming out of the weakest deciles and going into higher education. Now, I mentioned that housing tenure can change unpredictably, unlike age, between the two censuses, and we have here analysis by whether staying in the same decile, which is the middle panel across, as opposed to moving to a higher decile in the lower panel, and as opposed to moving down the weaker towards the weaker end of the scale towards 1. And looking at the tenure in 2001, which is down the left-hand side, and then the bars, the colors reflect the composition in 2011, the tenure composition in 2011. So, just in brief, one can note the bigger shift from private renting for moving to lower and higher decile than staying in the same decile. We can also see more people stay owners if they move up to a higher decile than if they move down to a weaker decile. But there's a lot of other information in there which we could take out if we had the time. The only thing to point out here, which this hasn't been adjusted by whether people were living with their parents in 2001, because there could be there will be an element of shifting, for instance, out of an owner-occupied household into private renting as a student or a first stage of their careers. So the data hasn't been, those sorts of people haven't been taken out of that, and it's a factor that needs to be considered. So this is a summary of these initial findings. I don't think I need to go through them all again, since they repeat what I've already said. What I want to emphasize just in concluding is the benefits of using the ONS LS to study migration. So its linked census data allows the analysis of 10-year address changing, allowing longer-term trends to be identified, so we can compare what happened in the noughties with the 90s and back to the 70s, as Fran and Ollie made clear. Classification codings like the Stronger Town Index that we developed here can be attached to the relevant geographies stored for LS members' usual addresses at each census. In using the linked census records, migration can be analyzed in terms of people's starting characteristics, as well as the characteristics after the move. When you look at one-year data, migration data from individual censuses, you don't know what people's circumstances were 1 year before they moved. You only know after move details. So this is a great advantage of the ONS LS. And so, as a result, people can be classified in terms of the changes in people's characteristics over the decade. Whether movers change, for instance, their qualifications, their occupation, or as we've just seen, their housing tenure. And what I would be particularly interested in seeing in terms of more detailed work on this is changes in social status, occupationally based status, labour market position, and qualifications perhaps. Part of my previous research that Fran referred to on the LS was following up Tony Fielding's original work on the escalator region approach, which hypothesized that people early in their careers living in a weaker part of a country would be tempted to move to a region where they would advance their careers more quickly in terms of escalator region like London and the southeast. And this was mainly focusing on the destination of those often usually young adult movers, whereas the next step here would be to focus in on the origins of these people in the weaker areas from which they come, and see how their careers progressed if they moved to London and the southeast from one of these weakest areas, compared with the people that stayed behind in these areas. And also what the long-term prospects were. Some follow-up research that I did showed actually that quite a proportion of the people that moved in from the rest of England and Wales into the southeast region early in their careers had actually returned or actually left the southeast of England before they were retirement age. Fielding sort of suggested that they would be near retirement age before they moved out, but many of them were moving out in their 30s and 40s. And so this is something else that would be worth following up to see if, in policy terms, two elements, I suppose. One is, could more be done in terms of regenerating the local economies of the left-behind places to persuade fewer people to leave and more to remain in those areas? But secondly, is there any way of attracting back people that have moved out in the past and perhaps attracting them back earlier in their lives rather than waiting till their retirement age? So there's just two hints of policy there. Thanks very much.
Great. I think we've just got a few minutes for questions. I think we haven't got a floor mic, have we? No. You're wondering whether one was going to arrive. So basically, if anyone would like to ask a question, I'm going to sort of relay it through the microphone so that the lecture cast can... Oh, lift up.
Been told about it.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we'll start getting questions while that's being set up anyway, I think. Any questions? Please, I don't know if you'd like to say who you are as well. Would you like to say who you are?
Yes, I'm Daphne from IES. I would like to ask you whether you think there are important biases reported in your analysis by the fact that we cannot link the ONS LS with, for example, the Scottish LS when we look at internal migration.
Shall I just sort of relay that? So Daphne from IES, and wanting to know if there are biases in the fact that we can't link the English LS data, England and Wales data, with the Scottish.
Well, yes, I mean, I'm all for more data, but there's plenty of data on movement around England and Wales to keep us going on this. And of course, it is the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government for England that has set up this fund. So in this particular context, it wouldn't add anything. But we are obviously dealing with a specific population. It's a cohort of people who had to be in the census in 2001, 2011. And so it can't include newly born people, it can't include people who even emigrated to Scotland. It just got England and Wales. In this case, it's just England. And of course, we're not including in this anyone who immigrated from over the intercensal decade. But while we're on the topic of the Scottish census, there is LS. There is one important benefit, as also is for the Northern Ireland longitudinal study, in that they have managed to link in their administrative data on change of address between censuses as derived from the records of their health services. And so in Northern Ireland, every 6 months, we have people's change of address since 2011, and in Scotland, I think it's a 12-month change of address. And that's a really powerful thing to be able to do, which the ONS LS has not managed to achieve yet. It has medical data, as was mentioned, on births, deaths, marriages, cancer-type notifications, but not on change of address between censuses. Do you want to add anything, Ollie?
Just sort of quickly about the LS in England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. The index that we constructed was constructed for England because that's what the Stronger Towns context sort of framed it as. So in theory we could do it for the whole of the UK, although the input data sets that we're using don't stretch across the whole of the UK. England and Wales would be fairly easy rather than England, but getting the same data for Scotland and Northern Ireland would be a bit trickier. One of the things, just in terms of the LS though, in talking about that, the sample in the Scottish LS is bigger than the sample in England and Wales, and the sample in Northern Ireland is again larger. They are sort of mutually containing each other though. So the sample birth dates that are used in England and Wales are used in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. So in principle, we could observe people moving from England and Wales into Scotland and Northern Ireland. Actually doing that is a whole heap of other problems. But we can't see people necessarily coming back from Scotland or from Northern Ireland into England and Wales.
In order to keep us to time, probably just one more question now. We'll have time later on. So I'm not sure if there's someone over there, or which one of you two? Oh, here we go. If you'd like to say who you are and... I'm going to struggle to summarise that, but is there more granularity in the data by decile, particularly on things like income levels? Is that right?
Income levels is something which the census has not managed to capture ever. The work that's currently going on transforming population and migration statistics is working on administrative data that can be incorporated and perhaps actually linked in at the individual micro level in due course, but it's not there at the moment. So this is there's always been a weakness. We've had to have proxies for how well off people are. But there is one new data set, an experimental statistics at the moment, which ONS has compiled, and which Richard, you've had some experience with, I think, again. This is called the earnings progression and geographic mobility data set, which has compiled data from DWP and the Inland Revenue, HMRC, to track people's movement since 2011 through to 2016 at the moment between local authorities, and track the change annually in their earnings so that you can look at the relationship between their earnings changes and their geographic mobility. They produced a ONS report last October, and are following up on this work, as I understand, although they're under huge pressures to do other things as well. So if that's a 100% sample of people, and so if that could be drawn upon to add relevant data to the ONS LS, that would be extremely powerful, because it not only builds through from the latest census, updates from the latest census, but it also gives you annual changes rather than the 10-year change that the ONS LS gives.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to come round and I'm going to hopefully get Rory's presentation onto the screen. Now then.